I'd like to introduce Michael Berkowitz. He's currently Professor of Modern Jewish History in the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at University College in London. And I am very happy to be chatting with him a little bit about his research in Jews and photography. And the first thing I'd like to ask you, Michael, is, in the past you've written about a whole range of topics, ranging from Jews and criminality, Zionism, and most recently displaced persons after World War II. So why Jews and photography, and why now?
I've always been interested in photographic evidence. I've been interested in visual things, and this partly comes from the approach to history that I was exposed to by my advisor at the University of Wisconsin, George Mossey. So I use this kind of material earlier. I've always had an interest in photographic documentation and things that were relatively realistic. But something happened in around 2005 or 2006 that caused me to be more interested in photography as photography in a way that I hadn't been before.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and did you find, as a historian, was it hard to make the shift from using that kind of documentation to work with, or?
Well, I found that it wasn't really that hard because I'd always been using it anyway, which mm-hmm. I've got to say was quite unusual when I started doing my work in the 1980s and then into the early 1990s. It wasn't something that many historians were using as a matter of course. So one of the nice things about it was very inexpensive, if not completely free, when I started. And now, of course, things have changed considerably since then. But I've always found it fascinating. Of course, I use other kinds of documentation, sort of traditional archival sources, but I've almost always been particularly interested in things that are photographic, which I think in part comes from my own background and being from Rochester, New York, and having some experience with the world of photography in that way.
Could you just elaborate a little bit? What do you mean? You're from Rochester, New York. So
I'm from Rochester, New York, which is the home of Eastman Kodak, which mm-hmm. at this very moment is not doing very well. It's in the throes of bankruptcy, mm-hmm. And we don't know if it will survive for very much longer. But I grew up in a suburb near the Kodak plant. My father actually worked at Eastman Kodak beginning right after his World War II service in 1945, and he worked there for 38 years. And I also worked there in the film emulsion melting department as a melter's helper in the 1970s, mm-hmm. In the summers when I was an undergraduate. So I've had some rather intimate knowledge of the Kodak plant and at least the manufacturing process for photographic film.
Okay, so I see your personal connection to it, but one thing that struck me is that Jewish historians have really only recently started to look at the history of Jews in photography, and what you and others have found is that Jews have really from the beginning, from its inception, been integral parts of it, both in Europe and here. Why do you think it's taken so long for historians to get around to researching?
I think there are a number of reasons why it hasn't been a topic that's been seized on by scholars, and I actually try to just say briefly what these are. I think the first and most important is that something that historians of photography really haven't quite recognized is that it really wasn't a very respectable profession mm-hmm. compared to other professions. Even though everybody loves the photographs, this was not something that sort of normal, upstanding people did, and it's part of the reason why Jews were able to get into it. It wasn't the kind of thing that most people would aspire to do. It wasn't a conventional type of career, and I think I'm finding out all of the different aspects now that were not quite, let's just say, not quite kosher to the general public, or that they were rather suspicious of. So I think that's part of the reason. Another reason is that almost all of these photographers, particularly studio photographers, were really wonderful at reinventing themselves. Mm-hmm. And very often this wasn't questioned. That is, they would make up names and identities and say that they were French or Spanish or Italian, and people basically gave them the benefit of the doubt. So you have these people, with names like Romeo and Bolero and Garibaldi and all sorts of things, and what I found is, generally speaking, they were Jews from Lithuania, mm-hmm. Or from similar places. So I think this really has thrown social historians off. And then the other thing is we have such a small amount of documentation connected to photography and photographic evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And then part of it is that when photographers and artists think of archives, they think of the pictures. They think maybe of negatives, of contact sheets. They don't think of the kind of documentary evidence generally like we think of as historians. And a lot of this has either never been saved or has simply been completely lost. So that is also, I think, a big part of the reason. Also, photography is just taken for granted.
Mm-hmm.
It exists. It's everywhere. So I think it's sort of people haven't caught up to think, wait a minute, there's a history behind this as well. So I think there are actually quite a few reasons why there really is an awful lot to be done, even in terms of a really basic social history of who were these people, where did they come from,
mm-hmm.
and what did they actually do,
mm-hmm.
which honestly doesn't quite exist yet.
And so can you tell us a little bit more about what you found out about Jews in particular? I know you work on photographers in England. Who were these people and where did they come from?
What I found is that almost from the very beginning, although Jews did not invent photography, as was sort of posed in this very interesting movie called The Governors, Jews certainly didn't invent photography, but they were there very, very soon afterwards in terms of using it to make a livelihood. And I think there are a couple different routes where they came to it, but I think Jews came to be very, very significant within it as early as the late 1850s and 1860s, in terms of there being a very large Jewish presence almost everywhere within the world of photography. And of course, a lot of it was involved in retouching, which a lot of people think came later on, but it was at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, Jewish women
mm-hmm.
were very involved in that aspect of things photographic. But one of the main reasons is that there wasn't any sort of guild or occupational regulations that kept them out. And even when such things did exist, they really couldn't be enforced. It was really hard to do it. So this is another reason why Jews got involved, and I think there are very particular reasons why they got involved with it in Eastern Europe
mm-hmm.
in particular. But what I found in the case of London and also Paris, even places in Central Europe, is overwhelmingly Jews came to these countries already knowing photography
mm-hmm.
and even having equipment with them. That is, they didn't arrive and decide they were going to do it. They came and already had it with them. That is, they were already practicing as photographers while they were in Eastern Europe, which is, I think, this is really quite different from a lot of other things that Jews did. Although they might have done the same thing, they weren't actually bringing all of the stuff with them and literally setting up shop the way that they did in the 19th century and early 20th century.
Okay. And I want to ask this question. It's related to the kinds of people who would come and be photographers, and which that you've spoken about. Is that, did Jews take photographs differently than other people? This is a big question that seems to come up a lot. Why does it matter that somebody's a Jew behind the camera? What have you found?
Well, I don't think that they take pictures differently. But it's a matter of, I think, sort of how they situated themselves as photographers in terms of their approach to their clientele, their approach toward business, technology, all sorts of different aspects. But as far as the pictures themselves, I don't really think there's an argument to be made in that way. I think that's really not the most fruitful approach. But when you start to consider people like photojournalists,
mm-hmm.
where they did get an opportunity to choose their subjects or what stories they were covering, then you can talk about sort of a different Jewish approach in terms of individuals who would be photographed or events that would be photographed or things that would be seen in different ways depending on whether a Jew was doing it or not. So I think that there is something there, but not in terms of Jews having a different eye towards people or buildings or anything like that. I don't really think that there is much to be said about that, but you certainly do have to consider Jews themselves and their situation as far as how they operated in this world.
Right, and by that do you mean in terms of having immigrated from another country, perhaps seeing the world a bit differently than somebody who was a quote-unquote insider? to society?
Well, I think that they did see the world. Generally speaking, they did see the world differently, and also the ones who were successful had a vision of being expansive in terms of wanting to serve as broad a public as possible. But as some of the Jewish photographers we know best are those who are focused on the Jewish community, and I think there are many others, and this has also clouded the picture. That is, very often people have sort of seized on these photographers who photograph mainly Jews, but there were Jews involved in photography who were mainly photographing everyone.
Right.
So this is really, I think this is really an important part of the picture.
Okay. And so maybe as we wrap up here, one final question related to what you mentioned before about Jewish women often being the ones who were photographers. Was that, what are the reasons for that, do you think? Have you found in your research any of the...
I think that part of it is that the field was relatively open, generally speaking. Like I said, there simply weren't official restrictions, and usually when there are official restrictions, the first thing that happens is that it's only men. But also I think because of the general character of photography studios often being family businesses and multi-generational, that it seemed to be very open to women in the family itself. And then also because of the way that a lot of these Jews operated, it meant that it might not have been all that unusual to have a woman being taken in for some sort of apprenticeship or to be working away in, say, some other kind of business or profession. It would have been very odd. And as I said, partly because of this fact of Jewish women having this expertise behind the scenes in doing the retouching, I think this also made for a lot of openings. I think we just keep finding out about more and more and more Jewish women who were notable photographers.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Michael, for your work. We're looking forward to your talk tonight, and thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.